Hey guys, one of the questions that I get asked a lot is what computer should I get to use Adobe After Effects, Adobe Premiere, Photoshop, or just for general filmmaking and visual effects. And one great thing that happened is Celina got me a new computer for Christmas. Now I got to pick the parts, Celina took care of the cost. What I want to do is I want to take you through building this computer, and I want to talk through why I chose the components that I did and why I think they're great to use for Adobe After Effects, Premiere, Photoshop, or for general filmmaking and visual effects. The main reason for why I'm upgrading my PC is actually because my current PC was giving me a lot of hardware problems. It was freezing up, instant crashing, doing a lot of nasty things, and I did try a whole lot of things. I work in IT, so I think I did my due diligence in trying to find out what was wrong. I still get the feeling it's a hardware fault with the motherboard that kicks in every now and then. Everything else seems to work fine. Problem is that if you replace the motherboard, unless you get a motherboard with the same socket, you will also have to replace the CPU. And the other problem as well, if I get a new graphics card, and I did kind of want to get a new graphics card, something with a bit more power behind it, they're usually way too big for my small MIDI tower, because this is my current PC. It's actually an ATX MIDI tower. The reason I really like this case because it's got an SD card reader right in the front. I don't need to install one in it, which I'm not a big fan of. But one of the big problems is with the graphics card. If you have a look, this is my current graphics card. It's a GeForce GTX 560. I actually really like this card, but all the newer graphics cards are way bigger than this. This is about 20 centimeters. All the new graphics cards go up to about here. They're really big. And so what I actually got, I actually did get a full tower case, a Corsair Obsidian 750D. But now with that precursor, let's finally start unpacking and putting everything together. Now, there are only a few things I'm going to take with me from my old PC into the new PC, and that are first off my RAM. This is 16 gigabytes of Ripjaw DDR3 RAM at 1600 megahertz frequency. It's really good RAM, and I do recommend getting quite a lot of RAM, especially if you're working with After Effects or maybe even 3D Studio Max or Cinema 4D. RAM is quite important, so I've got 16 gigabytes here, which is really good. I'm going to take these ones with me, and the other thing I'm going to take with me is all my hard drives, and I do have quite a collection of hard drives. I've got 6 all up actually. I've got 2 SSDs. I've got a Vertrex OCZ, 256 gigabytes SSD RAM. This is where my main OS and all my programs sit on. I do have a SanDisk Extreme 256 gigabytes SSD RAM, where I usually have all my media files. So I'll usually be working my programs off this, and all my media and my music and whatnot streams off this hard drive. However, this one is always quite full, and so I have actually got a new one, SanDisk Extreme. Pretty much the same one as this one, but this one is a 480 gigabyte version. I'm actually really happy to have gotten this little bit bigger one, so I don't have to constantly copy all my media files and my projects off this smaller SSD onto my backup drive. I do have 4 backup drives. 2 2TB Western Digital green, and they're the Caviar green. They're not as fast, but they're really just my backup drives. So once I'm done with all my projects, I copy all the data onto one of them, and the other one is really just a backup drive for programs, random things, just a whole lot of other stuff that I've got on the other one. The other thing I have 2 Western Digital 1TB blue. What I usually do is these ones are actually usually mirrored together, which means anything I copy onto one drive automatically copies over onto the other one. So the Western Digital blues and the mirror is really just for personal files, my photography, a lot of other things that I really care about are on there. And the main reason for the mirror is that if one drive fails, all the data still exists on the other drive. So that is really just for backup. And here are the 2 towers side by side. So this is my mid-tower ATX. The old one I'm going to get rid of just because size-wise the new graphics card simply won't fit in there. And this monster here, pretty big, full-sized ATX tower, Obsidian 750D. It's got a window on the side, which is kind of cool. Right now all I'm seeing is the reflection of my toolbox. But let's open this up. And there's plenty of space. There's 3 fans, there's 2 front fans, and it's got 1 back fan. Obviously plenty of space for the motherboard. And if you can see, the hard drive cage doesn't actually go up here. It's actually 2 at the bottom, and the reason for that is because if you cut the motherboard here and you got a very long graphics card, it'll actually extend from here over and often hits the case of the drive, so it's quite nice to have a bit of space here. I'm pretty sure my new graphics card will fit in here nicely. Alright, so this is now the case all the way opened up, and the very first thing we want to do is we want to place down the motherboard, and for that we're going to plug the CPU into the motherboard and then place the motherboard in the case. So this is the CPU I went with. It's an Intel Core i7 processor, a 4790K. It's also codenamed Devil's Canyon, which I kind of thought was kind of cool. It's a very powerful processor though, definitely better than my i2700K, which I had before. It's also a different socket. It's an LGA1150 socket, which means I also needed to get a new motherboard. So this is the motherboard I picked. It's an Asus Z97 Mark II. Sabertooth, obviously it's got an LGA1150 socket, otherwise I wouldn't be able to fit the CPU onto the motherboard. The main reason I chose it though is because it has 6 SATA connectors, and they're all SATA III, so all 6 gigabytes per second connectors. And as you remember, I have 6 hard drives, so they'll all fit nicely onto this motherboard. The only thing I'm missing out on is the Firewire on the back, which I'll talk about a bit later. I'll solve that a different way. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that motherboards usually come in these really funky plastic bags. Now, there's a reason for that. They're anti-static bags, because right now I'm standing on carpet. So what could potentially have happened is I could rub over the carpet, get a bit of static charge building up in my body, and then if I pull this out without releasing that static electricity first and I touch something, I might blow a transistor on the motherboard and basically just brick this whole thing. Now, the first thing you want to do, you actually want to ground yourself, and the easy way to do that is if you touch the inside of a PC case. If you have heating somewhere in the house, just touch the wire, and this is something metal on the ground that'll just release your static electricity into the case, or into the ground, so that when you unpack the motherboard, same with the CPU, when you unpack the motherboard or the CPU, you don't have any static charge in your body and you're not accidentally going to fry something. Another quick note on the CPU: when you're building a PC for After Effects, Premiere or 3ds Max, like any filmmaking visual effects really, a strong CPU is really the core for your PC. A lot of RAM and a good CPU, simply because most of the crunching is going to be done by the CPU. So if everything is great, but you get a really, really lousy CPU, performance is still gonna suck pretty badly. So here's the Sabertooth motherboard. It's actually got 3 PCI Express slots, which you can do triple SLI, which I'm not gonna do. 1 graphics card is really enough for me. Double and triple SLI doesn't really do too much for video work. It's really just more a gaming thing, but it's nice to have the option. Over here we have the 6 SATA III connectors, they're all 6 gigabytes a second, so I'm going to connect my 6 hard drives onto that. We got 4 RAM slots, DDR3, it's dual channel architecture, so I can plop my 16 gigabytes of RAM right nicely into here. And obviously we got the socket for the CPU, this is an LGA1150, so this is where we're going to plop the Devil's Canyon onto. When you buy yourself a CPU, you're usually going to get 2 pieces. You're going to get this chip, which is the really expensive part. This is the actual CPU. And the second thing you're going to get is you're going to get a fan, which is going to, sit right on top of the CPU and cool it. Interestingly enough, you're going to see a little bit of gray sticky stuff on the bottom of the fan. That's thermal paste, and that's actually just to ensure that the fan connects really nicely with the CPU, and all the heat from the CPU can get released through this fan. To install the CPU onto the motherboard, you first want to remove the safety lid. You can actually lift the side of this one up, lift that open, and you can kind of strip that off. And so now we've exposed the actual CPU socket. Be careful, never ever 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 bend a single pin in this. If you do, your whole motherboard is screwed, so don't do that. With the CPU, you will actually see that the CPU has little dents on the sides. These ones will actually prevent you from inserting the CPU in the wrong way around. So there's only one way it'll actually fit onto the socket. Make sure you don't force it. This has gotten so much easier. Back in the days, this one would have the pins and there'd be holes in the socket, and you literally have to fit it in and push it down. And if you had it wrong in any way, everything would bend and all screwed up. So this one's really nice. It's just very simple, and just make sure we're getting it the right way around. Place the CPU down in the socket, make sure that sits in properly. Push the lid down and then push the safety hook back down. This is going to take a little bit of pressure. Don't worry, you're not breaking anything. You're just pressing the CPU down, and the plastic lid can go. And so now you have the CPU exposed in the socket, and this way we're placing the fan on. To place the fan on, just get the fan off, untangle the power cable for the actual fan, because you don't really want to tie that down. It's usually connected on the side anyways. So this one usually doesn't matter which way around. The main reason I'm deciding which way around is where the power connector for the fan is on the motherboard, just so that I can tie that up nicely. No, CPU fan is actually at the back here, sorry, I got it wrong. Read what's on the motherboard. This is an asset fan, or an assistant fan, which goes onto the side of the case. The CPU fan is actually up there. So we will have to plop this probably this way around or that way around. No, I think I'll still prefer it this way around. So place the CPU fan right over your CPU. Make sure that those ones are down on the corners in the slots. And then you can actually press down on these ones to click them in. Make sure they click in. Press it down a little bit more to make sure everything's properly fixed on. Yep, and there you go. fan sitting on top of the CPU. And then just make sure that you're actually connecting the CPU fan. Again, these ones are kind of protected these days, so you can't really insert them the wrong way around, which is kind of cool. And it says CPU fan on the motherboard. So really just plug that in there. Come on, plop, there you go. And then you can kind of just tie up this cable. Next, to install the RAM, it's quite simple. Again, if you're looking at the RAM, there's a little dent on one side and there's a little bump in the slots, so you can really only insert it one way. Make sure you're not pressing it down the other way. Open up the clips on the side and then simply insert it. Make sure that the slots align. Make sure these ones 2 aligns, otherwise you can break something. And then press it down. Press it down that side until this one clips in, and that means your RAM is nicely slotted in. Make sure you hear the little clicking sound, which will indicate that the RAM has been properly slotted in. There you go, that's the memory and the RAM installed. All the RAMs installed, and so we're ready to place this motherboard in the case. As I mentioned, RAM is really important, especially when we're working with After Effects, 3ds Max, Premiere Pro, because they do shovel a whole lot of data, a whole lot of media into the temporary memory, which sits in RAM. And if you have very little RAM, there's going to be a lot of swapping with the hard drive going on, and everything's going to be pretty slow. So I like to have quite a lot of RAM. Usually 8 GB is quite sufficient. Personally, I prefer having 16 GB of RAM because I usually have, you know, After Effects, Premiere, 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, and a couple of browsers, a few other programs, everything open at the same time. In those cases, your PC can struggle, so I prefer having a bit of a buffer with 16 GB of RAM. Now, within the motherboard box, we should usually find, I'm not sure where it is. There you go. A lot of accessories, which is the back panel for the case, which obviously matches onto the motherboard. A different bunch of helper connectors, a few SATA cables, more SATA cables. And this is an SLI cable. I don't think we'll need that particularly. So these are all the elements that we're going to need to place this motherboard into the case. First thing is the back panel, which just goes at the back panel of the case. Careful when you're taking these ones out of the plastic package. I've gotten myself some really nasty cuts on my fingers just because they're really sharp on the corners. So do be careful when handling these. Just make sure you get them the right way around, the way the motherboard goes, and then all you have to do is kind of just align them. Make sure this is exactly how the motherboard is going to sit in the case, and then just press it in. There you go, we're ready. Next, for the motherboard, you will notice that the motherboard has little indents here, which usually has a number of them. There's another one. Let's see if we can zoom in on that. And there's another one. So there's little screw holes in the motherboard at specific spots. The other thing you're going to notice as well is that the case itself has these little nuts sitting in it. So there's one here, there's one there. So if you hear these ones align with the holes in the motherboard, you just have to make sure that depending on what motherboard you have one of these little nuts. You can actually unscrew them and take them out. Probably need to get a screwdriver for that to pull that out. But you need to make sure that every hole in your motherboard aligns with one of these nuts. Now, fortunately for me, because this is a standard ATX motherboard and a standard ATX case, all of the screws actually align really nicely. So there's 3 pins here, and it's got 3 holes at the top. And so you literally can place the motherboard in the case and make sure that the holes line up exactly with where the nuts sit. Also have to make sure that the back panel obviously fits through. So you've got the motherboard coming through here now. And now you can see all of these little holes here are actually aligned with the underlying nuts. With the nuts and the holes, all I have to do is now actually screw the screws in to, fix this down in the case. Actually, I lied. There's one more thing that I'm taking with me from my old computer, and that is the Kraken. My power supply. It's actually really good. It's a 750 watts power supply, and it's kind of a bit of a guess on how much power you're really going to need. If you have a powerful graphics card, I've got a GeForce GTX 760 in my new computer. I've got 16 GB of RAM, I've got 6 hard drives, quite a powerful CPU. You should probably have, 700 to 1000 watts on your power supply. No, it's not going to use this all the time. It's just going to pull from it when it needs. So 750 is the max wattage that this one can output. But it's actually a really good power supply. It's got lots and lots of cables to connect everything I need. So I'm going to take that with me and now plug it into the new machine. So once you've plugged your motherboard and your CPU and your RAM into your case, next thing is the power supply, and you can really just quite simply place this down at the slot below. and screw it in at the back. It's pretty simple. The other thing that a lot of cases these days have, and I'm really a big fan of this, are actually these little plastic gated gateways. And what you're supposed to do is all the cables from the power supply, which is usually a pretty big chunk, they used to go kind of just straight through the case, just make it really messy. You're actually supposed to feed these cables down through the back onto the back of the case, and then just feed them coming back out wherever you need them. So you can kind of come out here and plug into the graphics card, or you come out here and you plug into your hard drive. So you don't kind of string these cables all across. And I'm going to try to do this as best as I can as well. And so I'm just going to feed all of this stuff down into the back of the case and then come back out where I need it. Modern motherboards usually have one or two main power connectors. There's one here, which is an 8 slot, so I'm going to use this 8-pin cable. It's actually split into 2 4s, but you will notice that this will only go in one way, because see how they've got little shapes here on the power connectors? This will only go in one way, and so what I can do, let's see if I can do this with one hand. Flop, and put this one in there as well. And so I've got power number 1 connected on the motherboard. The other one is usually a really broad one. Again, this one just comes off the power supply. I've just kind of threaded around the back and through here. Again, it's a 2-piece, but again, this will only fit in one way into this connector. So let's push this down into there, and this one will only go one way. So there you go. So this is the motherboard now supplied with power. While I'm connecting the motherboard, might as well connect the power for this back fan here. So what I'm looking for is, I'm going to look for a little pin that says assistant fan. This one here, or it usually says case fan or something else on it, but and I'm just gonna cable tie this down to kind of keep it out of the way of the fan. The last thing you want to have is any of these cables going into the fan and blocking it, and so then your CPU overheats and potentially fries. So make sure you tie this one down neatly out of the way for the CPU fan. Next, let's have a look at the front panel. Obviously, most cases these days come with USB slots, all sorts of other things connected on the front, and they are usually connected via one main cable that's coming down here. Right now it's a whole bunch of loose little bits and pieces that we obviously need to connect to the motherboard. And the way we're going to do this is we're obviously going to again feed it through here down onto the motherboard wherever they need to be connected to. Now when it comes to these front panel connectors, there's 2 types. There's usually these blocky looking ones, so this is a USB 2 HD audio, so that's the audio connector for the headphones at the front, and this big chunky one is actually a USB 3. These ones are really easy to connect. It's usually fairly straightforward because on the motherboard, for example, this one's the USB 3, it'll say on the motherboard as well, and it's big chunky. These ones are going to be the USB 2 ports, and there's going to be an HD audio. I think it's going to be this one. The other ones that you're going to get, they're a lot more flimsy. Unfortunately, they're also a lot more important. They're these little ones here. Now, the reason these little ones are actually more important, because these ones are your power switch, your hard drive LED, as well as the reset switch and the PC speaker. Without these ones, your PC isn't going to work properly, and these ones are a little bit trickier to connect just because they actually go into a fairly messy little block. They usually go down onto this particular connector, and unfortunately, it's not very well described, so you usually have to refer to your motherboard manual to figure out what needs to go where in which direction, because they've got polarity, so you need to make sure you're sticking them the right way around. It just might not work properly. Let's see, there's my system panel connected now. Not as quite straightforward as some of the other ones, but make sure you get these ones right, because otherwise your system may not function properly. Let's also get the front chassis fans connected. Again, you just want to connect them to a suitable connector on the motherboard. I do have a chassis fan for 12 volts here. Unfortunately, I've got 2 fans on the front, but I've only got one connector for the 12 volts. There are a few other ones, but they're 6 volts. They're not going to work. It's also not going to fit, which just makes sure that you're not connecting the wrong things together. So I'm just going to leave one off for now. I'm just going to have one on the front, one on the back, and obviously the CPU fan, and hopefully it should be enough to keep the system cool. Next, let's get on to the graphics card. The card I've picked is a GeForce GTX 760. It's actually a pretty strong graphics card. It's got 2 GB of memory. I used to have a GTX 560, which worked quite well, but I figured, I do a lot of video work. After Effects uses less, unless using plugins like Element 3D, which uses OpenGL, and obviously the ray trace elements in After Effects use OpenGL. But Adobe Premiere uses the graphics card quite a lot, and the graphics card memory to buffer video as you're playing it back. So this is going to come in really handy. Oh, look at that. That's pretty huge, actually. That's the GTX 760. And if I hold that next to my GTX 560, my old machine, so that's the 760, which is quite a lot longer, especially given that you still have to put power connectors at the back. This would not fit at all into my old case. In my new case, however, there's plenty of space, so this is where the graphics card will sit. And because there's no disk cage at the back here, no hard drive case, it'll actually fit in nicely. And again, electrostatic back, so again, touch the inside of your case, the metal part, or your heating unit or something else to ground you and get rid of any static charge that you might have in you before you rip this one open. So here's my graphics card plugged into the motherboard. Note that this is actually connected to the power directly, because a lot of the modern graphics cards, especially the more powerful ones, do require additional power going into the graphics card. This just goes around the back of the case, comes back out there and just comes from my power supply. Back in the days, a lot of hard drives had to be screwed in, but a lot of modern cases, especially the Obsidian 750, it contains a whole bunch of bays that you can literally plug out. And for the SSDs, it's got even 4 bays for the SSDs at the back. And the way this actually works is you can literally just take one of these bays out, take that one out. Then you will just take your SSD and you slot the SSD into there, and then you can literally plug the case back into it. There you go. For a long time, as my main media drive, I used the SanDisk SSD, 256 gigabytes, but it did end up filling up quite a bit just because I've got, you know, hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of music, and then obviously every video project I do is about 30 odd gigabytes, quite big. And I ended having to shuffle them back and from my main backup drive. So I've now got an SanDisk SSD again, because I did like them and they work really well. But this one's a 480 gigabyte version, so hopefully it'll give me a little bit more space for all of my media without having to shovel it back and forth. So before I get to wire everything up, there are a few other things I'm going to plug into my computer, but they're quite small, so I'm not really going to go over too much detail. One is a DVD writer. The main reason I need this is because I've got Windows 7 on the CD, and without this one I won't be able to install it. The other thing, I've got a USB card because I have a hell of a lot of USB connectors at the back of my PC right now, mainly for a lot of music, my MIDI instruments, my drums, keyboard, all sorts of other things, and my printer. I do need this one, otherwise I won't have enough slots at the back. The last one is a Firewire card, and the reason I need Firewire is actually because my audio interface is a high-speed audio interface from PreSonus called Fire Studio Project. It's really great, but it uses Firewire, and the motherboard, the Asus Z97 Mark II, doesn't actually have Firewire inbuilt, so I do need a card to support Firewire. So now I've got my 2 SSDs for the main drive and my media drive, my mirrored safety drives and my backup drives in the case. I've got a Firewire card, I've got the USB port card in as well. Everything's set up. The only thing I need to do now is hook up the SATA ports and the power to all of the drives and devices, and then we're good to go. So power cables are wired up. It's still a bit messy, I'm gonna clean that up a bit. My main focus is I've got 3 lines of power coming out of my power supply, and so I want to use 1 line of power for my 2 main drives, 1 line of power for my backup drives, and 1 line of power for my mirror drives. And the reason for that is if there's a surge on any one of the channels, a problem with my backup drives in terms of power isn't gonna hit my main drives, etc, etc. So I do like to keep those lines of power a little bit separate. Now I actually have 6 SATA connectors on this motherboard, and they're all SATA III, so they're all 6 gigabytes a second. When you're getting a motherboard, some of these will be SATA II, which is 3 gigabytes a second. Now, if you're having normal hard drives in your machine, usually the read and write speed from the hard drive is going to be the bottleneck rather than the SATA port. However, if you have SSDs which read and write really, really fast, the bottleneck can actually be a SATA II port. And so I did want to get at least 2 6 gigabyte SATA III ports. Fortunately, this one actually has 6 different slots. They're all 6 gigabyte SATA III, so it doesn't really matter which way I wire this up. All of these drives I'm just going to connect up to the SATA slots so that they're connected to the motherboard. Cool, so I've got all my SATA ports wired up to the hard drives now. Last thing to do, close this puppy up and start it up. Before you plug in your machine, make sure that the power supply is turned to off before you plug the power cable in, otherwise you may fry your electronics. And then all I've wired up so far, my 2 DVI monitors and mouse and keyboard. There we go. Asus is starting up. Cool, so this now wants me to get into the BIOS and start configuring everything. Wow, that is a pretty fancy menu. We've come a long way from, just keyboard driven, or you even have to just type in text on a console. Pretty funky, it shows me all sorts of cool stuff. I'm excited on setting this up, but I think I'll spare you all the horrors of me installing all my software, because I think it's gonna go forever and be endlessly boring. And that's it, new computer is up and running. Now I have a ton of software to install, but I will spare you the pain of going through that with me, because it's hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of stuff that I have to put on there. Gonna be a bit painful, but I'm gonna get through it. I'm really excited about having this PC. Celina, thank you very much for this new computer. I'm really excited. It's gonna be so much easier and so much better. It's gonna be faster. it's gonna make a big difference. Given that this is something that I've really, you know, spent a lot of time on every day when I'm at home and I'm not at work, I will be using this computer. So I'm really excited. Thank you very much. That's gonna be awesome. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you have any other questions around what computer bits and pieces might be good, especially because it depends a bit on your budget. Obviously, this is quite a fancy PC. It's quite a good one. There are some more budgety options if you're, you know, looking for something just to get started. Leave me a message below. I will answer as quickly as I can and get back to you and hope to help you out. Hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, I will see you later.